Hello, friends, colleagues, and postgraduate students. Welcome to the third seminar in our series. This is the Humanities Religious Studies Research Collective. My name is Milad Milani, and today's speaker is Dr. Peter Mauch. Of course, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I'm on Darug land, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present today. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Mauch. Peter is a historian of modern Japan, focusing on Japanese-US relations in the Second World War period. He is a dear colleague and a core member of the collective. We are both members of staff in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts here at Western Sydney University, and of course share an interest in the history of religion. Peter has published widely on World War II era Japanese foreign and security policies. Among his writings are Sailor Diplomat with Harvard University Press, East Asian Monograph Series, Asia Pacific, The Failure of Diplomacy, ? With Cambridge History of the Second World War volume, and A Bolt from the Blue, published with Pacific Historical Review. Today, Peter will be speaking to us about the Emperor, the Pope, and the War, 1921 to 1945. And in doing so, Peter will be re-examining the origins of Japan's diplomatic relationship with the Holy See. He'll focus particularly on the juncture at which papal diplomacy met with the emperor's diplomacy, and he'll seek an understanding of the complex interplay between the emperor's particular concern for his people and the Pope's belief in the universality of his faith. Now, I'm keen to learn more. Peter, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thanks very much, Milad. Very kind introduction. I think I should probably begin by just following on from Milad's intro there and noting that I'm very much a naval/military historian with an interest not so much in the battlefields, but my particular interest is in, I'll put it like this, say, naval and or military doctrine, how that influences and impacts on naval/military strategy, and then how those naval and military strategies, how they in turn impacted on the Japanese decision-making processes. And which is to say that this leaves me particularly unqualified to step into the field of religious studies, and I ask everybody's indulgences on this one. I think it perhaps makes some sense to perhaps at least speak really, really briefly as to how and or why I kind of got myself into this topic. And the starting point is necessarily the Japanese emperor. Anyone with a smattering of knowledge of, say, certainly modern Japanese history will know that from roughly the mid-1800s through to the end of World War II, the Japanese emperor was, according to the then constitution, he was sacred and inviolable. And his role in the Japanese decision-making process is one of, or is a matter of hot dispute between and among scholars. So it's a highly polarized debate. At one end of the debate are those who would argue that the emperor was, for all intents and purposes, an autocrat who basically just made decisions and expected those around him to implement those decisions. At the other end of the poll are those who argue that he was a constitutional monarch and that he acted purely on the advice, or ultimately he was more or less a rubber stamp for decisions being reached at cabinet level and also by, say, Imperial General Headquarters. Actually, I think maybe herein lies one point at which maybe these observations I make today maybe offer some kind of, if they have any kind of scholarly merit, maybe herein lies one point of possible scholarly interest, because I think at least one thing that my observations today will demonstrate is that maybe those two poles are that actually either end of that debate is kind of wide of the mark, and that perhaps it's more accurate to locate the emperor somewhere in between those two poles, and so that he was, I would suggest, an active player in the Japanese decision-making process, but that the way that he was one among many, and the two most particularly powerful institutions in that decision-making process were, of course, the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy, and so he had to contend with them and others, as we'll see today, in that decision-making process. So there's some preliminary thoughts. So that's kind of a roundabout way of explaining how I've started to get myself into this question of, or into delivering a paper to folks interested in religious studies, because in essence, what I'm looking at then is the emperor's role in establishing a formal diplomatic relationship with the Vatican. And my starting point here is the emperor's own, we can call it any number of things. Many folk refer to it as his monologue. It is just as accurate to call it his reminiscences or his memoirs, which he put together in the immediate aftermath of surrender in World War II. So this is actually in the early weeks of 1946. And at that point, and in the course of a long monologue, or quite a lengthy set of memoirs, he made the following observation. He confided that that he had visited the Vatican in 1921 as Crown Prince. That was public knowledge. That wasn't anything earth-shattering. But the next points, I think, are of more interest. So he suggested that that visit to the Vatican when he was Crown Prince back in 1921 had convinced him of the need to establish a formal diplomatic relationship between Japan and the Holy See. He also claimed that in the course of this monologue / memoir, that Japan's eventual dispatch of a diplomatic envoy to the Vatican, which took place in April 1942, owed to his own, and I quote, personal initiative. And he'd hoped, according to this post-war reminiscence, that the Pope might use, and again I quote, his spiritual authority, and at the appropriate moment, negotiate an end to the war between Japan and its enemies. And so this is, I hasten to add that all of my comments here today are very much a work in progress. And so again, I ask once again for everyone's indulgence here as I kind of, as I try to make sense of some, at some point, certainly some reasonably unformed thoughts around what's happening here. But nonetheless, I take my cue from those, from the Emperor's post-war monologue, and take a look at the origins of Japan's diplomatic relationship with the Vatican, and in particular, at the Emperor's role in establishment thereof. And I note that I'm stepping into an almost complete scholarly void. The most extensive study of Japan's relationship with the Vatican actually predates discovery / publication of the Emperor's monologue. And for obvious reasons, it therefore does not reference those statements, and nor does it explore the Emperor's role in the Japanese-Vatican relationship. And so it's perhaps worth considering the probable reasons for this kind of scholarly black hole, as it were. And so, for one thing, the Catholic Church, as Kevin Doak at I think Georgetown University has pointed out, the Catholic Church has seemed altogether peripheral to the modern Japanese experience. And perhaps more particularly, in terms of what I'm talking to here today, the Pope did not play the peacemaking role which the Emperor had hoped he would play. And so it's entirely possible to write a history of Japan's the end game of Japan's war in Asia and the Pacific. It's entirely possible to do this without paying a single jot of attention to the Vatican. So, yeah, that also, I think, partly explains why perhaps nobody has taken up these comments of the Emperor and explored them any further. And then there's also the issue of sources, of historical source materials. And so aside from that, the monologue that I've already mentioned, there really, for a really long time, there wasn't really anything else out there. So we have, for example, the diaries of his, and it's such a great title, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal. They have long since, they became public knowledge during the post-war war crimes trials and were published in the mid-1960s. So they've been available for a long time. And there are some really interesting entries in those diaries where the Emperor raises the Vatican, and I'll explore a couple of those during the course of this paper. And then there are one or two memoirs of, including, excuse me, as I just cut that off. There are also memoirs, including that of a Catholic Japanese diplomat, Kanayama Masahide, who in fact was posted to the Vatican during World War II. But ultimately, those sources are of limited value in exploring the origins of the Japanese-Vatican relationship. And you'll perhaps notice that I'm not venturing into Western scholarship as it relates to this topic, and there's a good reason for that. One, there's nothing in English on this, and two, my linguistic abilities do not extend to, I don't know, French, Italian, etc. So whilst I have a sneaking suspicion that perhaps the Italians, the French aren't really writing terribly much on this, you'll have to, once again, you'll have to indulge me on that particular score. So in any case, you may then be wondering, in view of what I've just said, you may be thinking to yourselves, okay, well, how can you, what fuel do you have for the fire? How do you re-examine the origins of a relationship if there are no sources? But happily, sources have become available in the last roughly 10 years or so. And so the most important source is entitled Showa Tenno Jitsuroku, which translates to English as something like True Documents of the Showa Emperor. It's a compilation by Japan's Imperial Household Agency. And this is an enormous undertaking. It took them roughly 25 years to prepare the Jitsuroku. It's 61 volumes. There are over 12,000 pages. It's literally a day-by-day account of his life and times, and it cites over 3,000 separate documentary source materials, many of which remain completely off limits to scholars. So they're using diaries of I don't know, things like there's some pretty weird ones in there, like the ladies in waiting. So I'm not entirely sure who they were, but you can work with that one and make of it what you will. But women in the imperial court, and indeed many men in the imperial court, were also their diaries that have been accessed, which have shed all sorts of new light on what he was up to on that day-to-day basis. And I think importantly, certainly for my purposes, it was an editorial policy of the agency that this collection of documents include only the merest modicum of interpretation. And of course, we could get into a debate around, okay, well, the selection of certain documents over and above, or the prioritization of certain documents over and above other documents, perhaps that in its own way that's an editorial process, right? We're making they're making decisions around what is important and what is less important. Nonetheless, allowing for that, these daily entries really do refrain from anything much in the way of interpretation, and try as best they're able to stick to the diary entries, etc., that they've accessed in preparation of this particular source. And then the other source that I'll be looking at in some depth, I'll be using the both published and unpublished sources, records of the Japanese Foreign Ministry, so the archival records. And it will become clear a little bit later on in the paper where I'm sort of drawing on those, I think. And then finally, I have taken the briefest of glances at the Vatican's own, I won't even try to pronounce it, but the Vatican does produce volumes of its, collections of its foreign policy archival sources. And I've at least dipped into those and done my best with them to get at least some sense of what's happening at the other end of the spectrum, as it were. So, okay, now, so there's a quick discussion of, I think, hopefully, of where I'm trying to go with this particular topic. There's also a brief discussion of some of the restraints and some of the sources that are out there. And then I think it probably makes sense to at least look really, really briefly at the, just to help everyone contextualize things a little bit, to make some sense of, I mentioned before that the role of the Catholic Church in modern Japanese life seems entirely peripheral. So maybe it just makes sense to have a really quick overview of those early contacts between the Catholic Church and the Japanese. And the earliest contact came in 1549 in the form of St. Francis Xavier. This was Japan's, first encounter with Catholicism, and it was the starting point of what is now referred to as Japan's so-called Christian century. It actually took place against the backdrop of endemic feudal warfare. So whilst on the one hand, it's referred to as Japan's Christian century, it's also referred to as Japan's warring states period. In any case, Francis Xavier and the other Jesuits baptized actually several 100,000 Japanese across a couple of decades in the late 1500s. And for example, a couple of Japan's feudal lords at the time sent embassies, effectively embassies, to Europe to pay their respects to the Pope. And I'll try to name that. One was called the Tensho Embassy, and I think another was called the Keicho Embassy. And these left in, left for Europe in, say, the early to mid 1580s. But actually, whilst those embassies were over in Europe, Japan started experiencing some changes in its governance, and in particular, we have an edict in 1587, according to which I'll call in the ruler for want of a better word, and so just bear with me on that one. He pronounced that, and I quote, "false teachings from Christian countries could not be tolerated any further." And in keeping with that thinking, Japan's ruling Tokugawa family over the next 250 years violently repressed Christianity, whilst also enforcing a policy of national seclusion that provided Japan with only a really, really small window onto the, actually the non-Catholic Western world. So they had very, very minor and sporadic dealings with the Dutch. Anyway, a community of so-called hidden Christians remained in Nagasaki, which is right down in Japan's southwest. But otherwise, Japan completely closed itself off to the Catholic Church. Now, fast forward a couple of hundred years to the mid 1800s, the Western powers used their military superiority to effectively force Japan open to contact once again. And the ruling family were powerless to prevent the opening of treaty ports in a variety of places, including Nagasaki, but also, I don't know, for those of you who know something about Japanese geography, Yokohama, Kobe, Hakodate, a couple of others. This sudden, and in these treaty ports, as was the case around Asia, treaty ports were the points at which Westerners gained entry into into Asian societies. And so this sudden influx of Westerners, including, of course, Catholics with their sacramental needs, opened the way for the return of Catholic clergy into Japan. It was actually French missionaries. They began arriving from 1859. The Japanese authorities tolerated the situation, but they added a really important rider that the Catholic priests must not proselytize, that they were free to administer to the Westerners and their needs, but stay away from Japanese folk was the basic condition. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the missionaries were not particularly mindful of that condition, and it wasn't very long before they began preaching in probably what was pretty stodgy Japanese. Nonetheless, if we now fast forward just a little bit further, that ruling Tokugawa family, which established itself in the 1600s, it collapsed in 1868, and Japan launched itself on a kind of a nationwide effort at modernization and at catching up with the West and at becoming an equal of the West. This was the so-called Meiji Restoration, which, again, effectively sought to transform Japan into what they considered to be a modern nation state. The extent and pace of reform was dizzying in all but one respect. This new Meiji government continued the previous government's existing ban or prohibition on Christianity. And this was, I think, a natural outcome of the government's use of the emperor. So what they're doing, on the one hand, they're trying to lift Japan by the bootstraps and to effectively catch up with the West, but they're doing it by appealing directly to Japan's deepest past and to take their authority by, as they put it, restoring the emperor to his rightful position in the Japanese polity. And so, again, so they're looking back to Japan, to the core of Japan, of what it is to be Japanese effectively, and they take the emperor, they restore him, and by the authority they thereby gain, they then seek to take Japan into this new modern era. And so precisely because the emperor drew his authority from religious texts, religious traditions, it kind of makes sense that they would continue this prohibition on Christianity. The problem was, and the problem surfaced pretty quick, or it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that, so remember, the Japanese are intent on playing catch up with the West. The West, it became apparent very quickly that so long as the prohibition on Christianity remained, that the Westerners would continue to see Japan as uncivilized, and that really, really, really grated on the Japanese, And so within, by the early 1870s, they dropped the prohibition on Christianity, not because they were particularly keen to see the emperor's subjects, to see Japanese folk become Christian. Rather, they did this because religious freedom was seen as a necessary step if Japan was going to be called and regarded as civilized by its Western counterparts. And remember, that's everything that they're doing is with a view to catching up with the West. So being called civilized or uncivilized, that's a key component of all of this. By the 1880s, the Japanese government, in fact, went so far as to state that the native Japanese religion, Shinto, and this is the emperor has been referred by some as effectively a kind of a pope of Shinto, this native Japanese religion. So in the early 1880s, the Japanese government admitted or allowed that Shinto religious practices were not in fact religious, but were in fact civic duties of all Japanese. In other words, this was merely an expression of effectively nationalistic kind of pride and nothing more than that. And so it was against precisely that backdrop that it was in fact the Pope who took the early initiative, and the Pope's early initiatives were all aimed directly at the emperor. So he went straight to the emperor, and he was going in this instance to the Meiji emperor, and then his son, the Taisho emperor. And then I'm going to kind of zoom forward a little bit to the point at which the emperor I'm interested in, and I'm realizing now that I'm probably losing everybody by mention of so many different historical figures, but I think if I add his name to the chat function, so his given name was Hirohito, so he was emperor from 1926 to 1989, and this is the figure that I'm principally interested in. But just to recap what I was just saying now, the Pope in, say, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, established reasonably extensive contact with Hirohito's grandfather, as well as his father, which perhaps kind of lays a certain foundation for the period that I'm about to dive into right now. So let's see. The Crown Prince, Hirohito, undertook a tour of Europe in 1921. And probably in most people's minds, the principal destination was Britain. And I think there was a sense that he would learn from, I don't know, the ways that the British royal family, the way they carried themselves, etc., and that he would bring some of that back and would perhaps kind of model himself on that after he came back to Japan and after he himself became emperor. There's some really fascinating moving on the part of one Japanese naval officer in Europe. He was actually he was himself a Catholic. His name Yamamoto Shinjiro, his baptism name Stephen. He managed to secure for the Crown Prince a visit to the Vatican, and was able to secure direct visits to the Pope himself. And so that's where I really want to focus in on here today, as a starting point at least. So he arrived in, where shall we say? He arrived in Britain in early May. By mid-July, he was in the Vatican, and his tour of the Vatican began with an audience with Pope Benedict XV. They exchanged gifts and they spoke for roughly 30 minutes. Okay, the Pope made some really interesting comments in the course of this audience with the Crown Prince. He suggested that Japan could, as a nation, or kind of almost as a nation, could become or could convert to Catholicism without in any way endangering its emperor's system. So I think what we're seeing there is that at least so far as the Pope was concerned, that perhaps this was the key issue for so far as most Japanese were concerned. That okay, so if Japan goes Catholic, what does that mean? Given that the emperor draws his authority from those from the native Japanese religion, what does that do for his position in the national polity? At least the Pope is saying, it's not a problem. You can remain emperor. The Pope explained that Catholic doctrine did not require, as he put it, changes to established national polities and forms of government. He hoped, or he tried to assuage any possible concerns for what he called the patriotism of the Catholic faithful in Japan. And then, in an apparent reference to communism, the Japanese were powerfully anti-communist. The Pope asserted that the Church was struggling against all extreme ideologies and was acting in the interests of world peace and order. The Crown Prince's contribution to that conversation is nowhere recorded. But once that audience with the Pope himself ended, the Crown Prince and his entourage joined the cardinals, the princes of the Church. Let's see, maybe I might just bounce clean over the audience with the cardinals. They undertook a tour of the Sistine Chapel, the Apostolic Library, the Vatican museums, some of the Vatican's most treasured artworks, including Raphael's Madonna of Monteluce, Madonna of Foligno, and the Transfiguration were on display. So too were archival documents of presumed interest to the Crown Prince. These included letters attributed to those early feudal era embassies that I mentioned before. And also, I'll leave it at that. The Crown Prince completed this admittedly lightning tour of the Vatican. It was a 2-day tour, and wrote the following note addressed to Pope Benedict, and I'll read it in its entirety. It's only 3 or 4 lines long. On this occasion, as we leave the center of world Catholicism in Rome, Prince Kun In and we would like once again to express our thanks for the cordial hospitality afforded us yesterday and yesterday. We pray for His Holiness the Pope's well-being and honor. And on that note, the Crown Prince and his entourage boarded the naval vessels and sailed or steamed back to Japan. Now, what I'll do, I'll spend the next 5 minutes looking really briefly at subsequent contacts between the emperor and the Pope. And so I'll focus for the first little bit on what we might call reciprocal goodwill in the 1920s. So immediately on his return home, the Crown Prince learnt that his father was actually he was mentally ill and was no longer able to carry out his duties. This meant then that the Crown Prince became regent. So he was acting effectively, for all intents and purposes, himself as emperor. He remained mindful of the Vatican during that period while he was regent. He sent his condolences when Pope Benedict XV died in January 22. The following month, he sent his congratulations to the new Pope, Pope Pius. He granted audiences to apostolic delegates. He delivered messages via the apostolic delegates to the Pope. And interestingly, he entertained the apostolic delegates, and these, when he entertained them, he did this in a really interesting way. This isn't, to give you a quick example, this is let me see, I think I can't pick quite the date, May 23rd, 1922. The emperor joined the apostolic delegate to Japan for a luncheon, which also included a Japanese Catholic priest, Prince Fushimi Hiroyasu, Prime Minister Takahashi Korekiyo, Foreign Minister Uchida Kosai, and Imperial Household Minister Makino Nobuaki. This is treatment that was not afforded your usual diplomat. So the American diplomat, the British diplomat, etc., they were not afforded this kind of treatment. If they ever got a glimpse of the emperor, it was a kind of a glimpse. They were certainly not treated to luncheons that included other dignitaries and allowed for presumably kind of natural conversation. The Pope, and there are at least a couple of those luncheons with assorted dignitaries through the 1920s. The Pope returned the goodwill later in, when shall we say, in 1927, immediately after the Crown Prince had, by this stage, had just been enthroned as the emperor. The Pope gifted him a gold coin, which commemorated some bishop's ordination. And if we take a look through the 1930s, and I think that's, in a way, that's kind of interesting in the 1920s, because historians tend to shoehorn or to see the 1920s as a period where Japan was playing a role as a responsible member of the international community. And so I think it might, in one sense, be easy to see what's taking place between the emperor, between the emperor and, say, the Pope's delegates in Japan as part of a wider, I'm not really quite sure where I'm going with this, part of a wider Japanese, or it sort of fits with the way that the Japanese saw their own position in the world as a responsible member of the world community, and kind of playing their role in that world community. I think it becomes interesting in the 1930s because this is the point at which Japan shifts away from that kind of position and instead starts pursuing what we might call a kind of a career of aggression in China, and starts its relationships with Western nations, the US and the Brits in particular, really starts to deteriorate in a pretty rapid ways. And so it's interesting to see how the the emperor's continuing initiatives with the Pope's delegates in Japan continue just as they did in the 1920s. But it's happening against that backdrop of Japan, of an overall Japanese policy, which is one of shifting away from any kind of cooperation with the West. It's much more of a kind of a, yeah, I hesitate to try and characterize it in an entire decade in a word or two, but they shifted away from that kind of cooperative policy, and instead there was a much greater emphasis on kind of going it alone, I guess, as it were. So what we see during the 1930s then, actually, maybe the point of most interest is an audience he held with Archbishop Edward Mooney. He's an American-born bishop who was actually really interested in the process of the Catholic Church's enculturation in Japan. And here I think this is probably a point which is perhaps, I'm kind of guessing, of most interest to this group, perhaps. And unfortunately, I have very little to say on this one because, again, I don't know, as a military historian, I feel a little out of my depth when I'm talking about Catholic Church's enculturation in Japan. Nonetheless, I think this statement is really interesting because Mooney explicitly permitted, this is in 1933, that the Catholic faithful might participate in Shinto ceremonies. One more time, he explicitly permitted that Catholic faithful might participate in, so Shinto, remember, being the native Japanese religion, explicitly permitted that this was perfectly okay. And according to an official directive which he issued in January 33, these Shinto ceremonies were merely, and I quote, a manifestation of the love of one's country and loyalty to the emperor. So here we see a kind of a completing of the circle. So remember that the Japanese government in the 1880s effectively said that these Shinto ceremonies were not in fact religious, and that they were in fact just a kind of a civic duty or a patriotic duty. Here we have the Catholic Church in Japan's basically parroting precisely that line and saying that that one could be both Catholic, or one could be Catholic and participate in those rituals without any contradiction whatsoever, which is kind of interesting. And I wonder what the emperor made of that, because of all the Shinto rituals, and this really comes through very loud and clear in the course of that Imperial Household Agency compilation that I mentioned before. The emperor himself is performing rituals on almost a daily basis, and I just wonder about the compatibility or otherwise of these things. Nonetheless. So what we're seeing here again, so we're seeing that closing of the circle in one sense, but we're also seeing some really okay, maybe if I offer the next thought, this takes place in 1933. We have again an apostolic delegate to Japan arrives in Tokyo, visits. First up, has an audience with the emperor. Immediately after the audience with the emperor, he goes direct to Yasukuni Shrine, which has in the meantime become famous/infamous as the shrine, the home which enshrines all of Imperial Japan's war dead. And he went from there on to Meiji Shrine, which again another Shinto shrine, Japan's native religion, commemorating the current or Hirohito's grandfather. So this was not, I think, mere window dressing, because we also have the apostolic delegate in Japan telling Catholic priests in Japan in August 37 that visits like this to Shinto shrines were necessary because they showed comprehension and empathy, as he put it. And that, as he saw it, would, and I quote, make it possible for the gospel to penetrate into these new surroundings. So once again, I think we're maybe here, I'm sort of in that area of enculturation, and I'm not sure, maybe that's best left to the Q&A period, because, and I'll actually just rely on everybody else to offer comments on that, because I'm not 100% sure what I can possibly offer. So in any case, I think what we're seeing in the 1930s, once again, is the emperor, there's a real constancy between what he did as regent and then emperor in the 1920s. The same patterns are playing out in the 1930s, despite the Japanese government overall pursuing a really different overall sort of foreign/security policy. And I think that's kind of interesting. I note that I've already spoken for 45 minutes and I need to go really fast. There's a really brief interlude, and I won't go into this in too much detail. This is where I start becoming more comfortable in this next part, because it gets me a little bit closer to what I think I normally do. It's a quick discussion of Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka Yosuke, who served as foreign minister from July 1940 through till July 1941. This guy was really something. He was, he was poison for Japan. His foreign policies took Japan a hell of a lot closer to war against the United States and Britain than they had been previously. But he's a really interesting character. Whereas most Japanese diplomats are trained, were graduates of Tokyo Imperial University, he was a graduate of University of Oregon Law School. So among other things, he's an outsider. He spoke English probably better than most of us in this Zoom room right now. His English was immaculate, and he had this raw verbosity. His mind, if you were to put it unkindly, he was a kind of a scatterbrain. Any conversation that you read that this guy is involved in, he's kind of zooming around a million different, it's like you're in a pinball machine and he's the pinball. He's just kind of zooming around super fast. But he was also vainglorious, and he had, he was super sympathetic to Nazi Germany. And there's maybe not a consensus, but there's a suspicion that he had his own ideas about where he might possibly take Japan if he were himself to become perhaps prime minister. Nonetheless, he's super interesting for a couple of reasons. One, he was Catholic. Two, he had a couple of really interesting conversations with the Vatican's diplomats in Japan. And ultimately then he made a trip to Europe in April 41, and also had a couple of interesting conversations with the Cardinal Secretary of State. And most importantly for our purposes, what we're seeing here is in this period when Matsuoka was foreign minister, and it's classic Matsuoka, he effectively, so the initiative that the emperor had been kind of playing out in his own kind of quiet way through the 1920s and 30s, suddenly Matsuoka grabbed a hold of that and kind of took the bit between the teeth, as it were, and decided that he was going to ramp up efforts at establishing a more formal diplomatic relationship with the Vatican. And across a couple of different conversations, he makes a really interesting, a couple of really interesting assertions. One, he keeps insisting that the Vatican should stir up American Catholics and in fact turn them against the Roosevelt administration. And the guy is, like I said, he's pretty wild, he's pretty crazy. And to be honest, I'm not sure that he even realized that would have come across as being particularly manipulative. In fact, he saw it as a kind of a transactional thing, because in one breath, he would say, we need you to stir up those American Catholics and to turn them against President Franklin Roosevelt. In his next breath, he said, oh, and in return, we'll give you a formal diplomatic relationship between Japan and the Vatican. So I think he saw it as a purely transactional thing. The Vatican didn't quite see it, and they saw it as just manipulative, and they weren't particularly impressed by the guy. Nor, for that matter, was the emperor. In any event, actually by, say, I don't know, by June 1941, most of the foreign minister's colleagues, his own colleagues in government, were questioning his sanity. He kind of that capacity to kind of zip around a million different things in a single conversation actually started to unravel, and they started to question his sanity. So he kind of they discarded him like a spent shot. He was kicked out of any kind of decision-making responsibility. And it's kind of interesting because two things happen as a result, following that. On the one hand, Japan continued to hurtle towards war in Asia and the Pacific. On the other hand, the emperor, again, perhaps only quietly, and certainly not in a manner in any way akin to the way Matsuoka did things, but very quietly, he kind of took the initiative back in terms of the relationship with the Vatican. And we see this first on October 13th, 1941. So this is roughly six weeks or so, a month and a half or so before the Pearl Harbor attacks. And the emperor makes some interesting assertions at this point, because at this moment, without going into any detail, it was perfectly obvious that Japan was, at best, it was one step, maybe half a step away from war with the United States and Britain. And so all Japanese decision makers were kind of turning their attention, or everything was hinging on that question: do we, don't we? Do we, don't we? Effectively. And there's actually only one voice which is offering an alternative opinion within the Japanese government, and it's in fact the Japanese emperor. And so in mid-October, he spoke with his Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, and he made the following assertion: in the event of a decision for war against the United States and Britain, it will be necessary from the outset to examine thoroughly measures to end the war. Which I think is really, really interesting, because he's turning the conversation in a really, really different way. And anyone who, I don't know, just to switch the conversation really briefly for a second, Colin Powell died reasonably recently, I think. He's one of my all-time favorite people from, I don't know, say the late 1900s, early 2000s. But if anyone's aware of the Powell Doctrine, it has a bunch of, there are 7 or 8 questions which he insisted must be answered before the United States went to war. And one of those questions that he insisted must necessarily be answered is, okay, how are we going to get out of that war? If we're going to go in, how on earth do we get out? And his point being that it's a whole lot easier to go in than it is to get out. And perhaps Putin might be thinking that right now, right? How the hell is he going to get out of that? He's stuck, right? So the emperor's asking that same question, right? He's saying, okay, all of you guys are talking about do we or don't we go in, but actually he takes or offers an altogether different take. He's like, okay, so once we go in, how do we get out? And so anyway, to continue the diary entry, for this purpose, according to the emperor, it will be necessary to exchange diplomatic envoys with the Vatican and to establish friendly relations. And so, like I said, here again, what we're seeing in the aftermath of once Matsuoka left or was dropped from the Japanese government, we're seeing the emperor quietly and in his own way kind of retaking that initiative, which has kind of been almost like his hobby horse for the last 2 decades or so. I can see that I'm not going to get any farther than the ultimate dispatch of an envoy. So I'll just make a couple of really quick observations about some subsequent statements he made. The first one comes in early November 1941, at which point it's a little bit difficult to characterize Japanese policy, but the prime minister reported to the emperor and explained that the government had decided for war against the United States and Britain. It had also decided to continue diplomacy, and that if diplomacy was somehow successful in the next 4 weeks, in other words, before December, then they would call off the war and that they would pursue a peaceful approach. That was the report to the emperor. The emperor responded in the strangest of ways. This is to his new prime minister. He turned and said, okay, it's time for you to investigate the possibility of settling this difficult situation through the Pope. The prime minister's response is nowhere recorded, but I kind of have a sneaking suspicion that his eyebrows raised a little, and he kind of just felt uncomfortable for a little while as he thought about it all and was thinking, so what the hell am I meant to do here? but certainly, at the very least, his response is nowhere recorded. I have a feeling that he didn't say anything much earlier, just sort of sat there and thought, oh my goodness, where are we going to go with that one? So anyways, nothing came of the suggestion, of course. The Pope was not, ultimately the problems were actually within the Japanese decision-making structures. And so it's hard to see how the Pope could possibly have intervened there. Nothing came of the suggestion. By early December, Japan was at war with the United States and Britain. And maybe I can just take the story up to the dispatch of that official envoy in April 42, because I think there's a couple of key moments in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attacks, where once again the emperor keeps coming back at everybody and says to them, okay, it's time for us to send that envoy over to the Vatican. And maybe rather than spell those out one by one, maybe I'll just ask you to take my word for it, and note that on at least 5 separate occasions in that period between, so Pearl Harbor is December 7 or December 8, 1941, and then the actual dispatch of the envoy in April 42, he raises it, I'm thinking 5 times, where he speaks with the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and also the Navy Minister, and is repeating this request that Japan basically hurry things up and get that envoy over to the Vatican, again, with a view to go back to the memoirs that the emperor produced at the end of the war, in the hope that Japan might be able to draw on what he called the Pope's spiritual authority, and that the Pope might ultimately be in a position to negotiate peace between Japan and its wartime enemies. I think I spoke for a whole lot longer than I had kind of intended. So maybe that might be a good point for me to stop right there, Milad, and then ask where we go from here.